or something. I don't know.
That's not how f-stops work.
I don't know.
That is not how f-stops work.
The shutter speed, yeah. 30... I don't know what it is.
So, all right, can I tell you a story that you can use to blackmail me?
Yeah. That's all I'm looking for.
I know. Okay. So when I was an undergraduate, I was working, very lucky to be working with a very famous evolutionary biologist named Bob Trivers. We just accidentally ended up at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he happened to be. And I was already really deeply interested in evolution, and so anyway, took his course. Heather and I became friends with him. He took me to Jamaica to be his research assistant, and I was doing photographic work. He was studying lizards, and he was studying a hypothesis called the Hamilton-Zook hypothesis that says that the displays that males have that females require them to show in order to mate with them, that these displays actually are evidence of being free of pathogens. That's what males are advertising, is that they have been resistant to pathogens, and that their resistance would be something that they could pass on to offspring, so females would be very interested in it. So anyway, we were looking at dewlaps, which are these little flaps that these lizards extend below their necks that are often colorful in most species, and I was doing the photographic work, capturing the images of the dewlaps so that they could be compared. And Bob, who loves Jamaica, he married a Jamaican woman. They were divorced at the point that I was working with Bob, but nonetheless he has ensconced himself in Jamaican culture as much as possible, and loves a good joint as much or more than the next guy. Was constantly smoking pot while he was working, which is not abnormal in a Jamaican working environment. The pot isn't so strong that it gets in the way of your work, and so people smoke pot and they do work, and no big deal. But he kept offering it to me, and I had to lay down the law with him: no pot until we were done working for the morning, because I couldn't keep track of the damn f-stop since it's a reciprocal. So anyway, if the f-stops were done in some other way, where they weren't a mathematical reciprocal, maybe I could have smoked. But
men tend to be use humor, like human males use humor.
Yes.
As a display.
Yes.
Is that somehow a display of a pathogen-free mind?
No, no, I really don't think so. Yeah. But, yeah, so the thing is, this whole hypothesis that sexual displays are an indicator of being pathogen-free has always struck me as not quite complete enough. In other words, a female doesn't particularly care whether you're pathogen-free because your immune system is highly functional if your eyesight sucks. What she cares is that she gets a genome in which everything pretty well works. And so my guess would be that the hypothesis is wrong, that it includes cases in which a vulnerability to pathogens is something that the female wants to avoid, but really she wants to avoid anything that will get in the way of the well-being of her offspring. And so she's looking for an integrative measure that says, effectively, how successful are you in the habitat? So that does raise the question of why males are so often funny and why females are so attuned to humor. And I will say, I think this is changing in human beings in recent years, that there's a long tradition of female comics, but the degree to which women in our society are consciously funny rather than just consciously observers of humor has changed a lot, I think, in my lifetime. But I find it particularly telling that women actually rate humor very highly when they are discussing traits in potential mates. The thing that makes for really high quality humor is the noticing of stuff that others are aware of but wouldn't think to put words to. So if you think about, Jerry Seinfeld or some other well-known comic, the surfacing of certain truths that are easily recognized but that you've never heard said before is very, very funny. And so my guess would be that for young men in a traditional environment where success or failure functions according to whatever men have succeeded at or failed at, that the ability to notice that which others can recognize once it's said but wouldn't think to have said out loud is an indicator really of a kind of ability to spot opportunity. Also, there's something very interesting in the fact that if you've ever watched some hierarchical organization where there's some person, often a guy, at the very top of the organization, the CEO of the company, and they can tell really lousy jokes, just low quality jokes from the point of view of timing or anything, but it causes a lot of laughter. So to an extent, in a classic environment, a female who was noticing that a man was causing others to laugh would be able to detect two things. One, either that man is able to notice things that others aren't as capable of noticing, and that would be potentially a good bet for somebody who would find an opportunity in a marketplace or in a habitat or whatever, some opportunity that others had missed, or that a man has the kind of power that causes others to laugh at their jokes in order to ingratiate themselves. And either one is good from the point of view of picking a mate who is liable to be in a position to provide well for a family and protect them, things like that.
And entertain you along the way.
And entertain you along the way. Yeah, so that classic thing that I don't know if women really did say it very much, but he makes me laugh, that's a really strong positive sign, would be
On the level of a trope.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so you said that one formulation of humor is the putting together of things in a way, or making an observation in a way that other people haven't seen. So there's a novelty aspect, but that's humor, but isn't wisdom a version of doing that? Is wisdom related to this foolishness?
Well, let's talk a little bit about wisdom. So the first thing to realize is that wisdom has a relationship to intelligence, but it's not a straightforward linear relationship. That it is perfectly possible for a person to be extremely smart and very unwise, and that in recognizing, in taking that smart person who is unwise and basically subtracting the wisdom from the intelligence, we can figure out what it actually contains that's special. And what I would argue is that there are lots of things that are just simply true that one can notice or calculate, but that there are also lots of effects that exist a couple of levels up that cause the simple calculation to be misleading with respect to ultimately what is valuable. So there's a way in which a wise person knows not only how to calculate what's true, but knows how to weight a bunch of truths relative to each other in order to figure out what the best pathway through something might be. So it's basically an integrative function rather than a raw mental horsepower function. One thing I find myself noticing as a parent and as a professor of many students is that one of the things about youth that tends to get in the way of children or college students is that they are impatient about certain things that are very important not to be impatient about. And so, for example, if you are interested in solving deep analytical puzzles, right? If that's your taste, you want to know, why males in some species display these elaborate, flashy dances or plumage or whatever. That's a difficult question. And if you have to know the answer right now, well then you're not going to make it, because the fact is nobody who's studied the question has gotten there yet. So you're going to have to do something better than all of those very smart people who have attempted and largely failed to this point to fully answer the question. We know something about the answer, but we don't know it fully. And so, what are you going to do differently? Well, one thing you might do differently is file the question in a place that, as information that's relevant to the answer passes in front of you in one way or another, you collect it and you build a model and you begin to test hypotheses, rather than feeling like, oh my God, we've been lecturing about sexual selection for 2.5 hours now. Just tell us, why are these animals doing this crazy stuff? So, I guess what I would say is that I'm not sure I would say it is the core of wisdom, but I would certainly say it is a core of wisdom. Delayed gratification. Delayed gratification is one of the central pieces of wisdom. The ability to invest in something in the present in a way that it may be costly, while knowing that what you're pursuing is some benefit that may be substantially down the road. And if you think about the difference between the way highly successful adults and very smart kids behave, you'll realize that the very smart kid is very eager to demonstrate exactly what they've got, and the wise adult may be willing to, be working on something that isn't obviously of value for most of the period of time that they're working on it, in an effort to 6 months or a year or maybe even 5 years down the road have something that's worth all of that investment to show for the project. So the ability to understand that you are investing at a cost now for a benefit that will only emerge much later is it's maybe the most important lesson that takes a smart person and allows them to become wise.
And that's a lesson that takes time to learn?
Well, that's a good question, is how does an impatient young person ever discover this? Because that impatience will cause them never to happen onto a situation in which this style of looking at things pays off. So in some sense, one of the tragedies of wisdom is that it isn't automatic, that you accumulate it simply if you live enough years. You tend to get wiser, but you don't necessarily get what we don't say most people aren't wise. Most people are too easily trapped by the false promise of a get-rich-quick scheme or some idea that seems incredibly promising but doesn't pan out. Whereas something like, an inventor may build dozens of prototypes, each one of which will suck up resources and time, and none of them will save enough labor or provide enough extra value to justify what was put into it. But that isn't their purpose. Their purpose is to discover what you didn't know about the process of building the object in order to get it to work really well. So one way to say it might be that the product of prototypes is the improved mental model rather than the object itself. And in fact, this is one of the things, I always wonder why nobody says this to college students, but college students produce a lot of stuff during college. Those of us who have graduated from college realize that very few things that we produced in college are ever published or seen by anybody. They don't matter, and that isn't their purpose. The purpose is, in learning to produce them, your mind is enhanced such that later on, when you decide what it is that needs to be produced in the world, or what it is that you want to contribute, you have the tools to go about doing it. And so I often fear that because the work that takes place in school looks a lot like the work that takes place in a job, that students think that their purpose in school is the production of stuff, the production of papers or something, rather than the production of an enhanced mind that's capable of being pointed at very different problems later.
Not the production of value, but the production of the capacity to create value.
That's well said. The production of tools sharp enough to do something refined later on.
And hands adroit enough to wield those.
Right.
So how do you teach wisdom, then?
Well,
Other than failure?
oddly, first of all, there are a lot of ways to teach successfully, and one of the foolish things about our educational system is that it tends to shunt us all into some idealized model of how to convey things like wisdom, and because it's such a poor match for most of us, we're not very effective at it. So, discovering that the way you teach wisdom may be very different from the way somebody else teaches wisdom, and that is not an indictment of either method, is one kind of wisdom. But I would say, for me, the recognition that far too much of what we understand is generated by, or is passed to us by people who are conveying something on some authority. And I'm not indicting it by saying it's authority. It may be that a chemist is telling you how a reaction works based on long years of exposure to chemistry. But from the point of view of the person who's listening to that lecture, this isn't something that you've established yourself. This is something that you're taking on the authority of the chemist who told you that. And so the problem is, with chemistry, you can be pretty sure that if somebody who's spent their career studying these processes is telling you X, Y, and Z are true, they probably are. On the other hand, there are a lot of things over, in the humanities, the social sciences, even biology, which is so complicated that we don't have a complete model of it. It is very easy to be lured into believing things that sound like they're right and that authorities believe are right that are actually false. So there's no shortage of such things that have compelled people and misled them deeply, like the idea that depression is in general the result of a chemical imbalance, right? Or that addiction results because of a cycle in which your body simply comes to be dependent on the molecule that you've introduced, and when you take that molecule away, you suffer from a deficit of it. It's not that there's no truth in either of these. There are cases of depression being the result of a chemical imbalance, but depression is also likely to result from circumstances that are very difficult to navigate, especially developmental circumstances can build counterproductive patterns. And addiction, we now know, is in large measure the result of not having good options. That whether we're talking about animal models or people, that people who have rewarding stuff to choose are much less likely to become addicted, and that people become addicted to various things like opiates when they're stuck. So getting people unstuck is sort of the key. My point is that both of these models lasted for decades, where people passed them on as if they were true, and in fact they were, at the very least, much less than a complete explanation of anything. So the result of all this is that one should become suspicious of any truth that is heavily dependent on the accuracy of some authority's understanding of something that is complex enough that the authority could actually be wrong and you would have no way of knowing. And the cure for that, the answer to your question about how you teach people to be wise, is you induce them to confront some system in which authority plays little or no role. So, for example, let's say you take up robotics, and what you're going to do is you're going to build little robots that do funny things and aren't especially useful to anybody. Nonetheless, if you're going to build a robot and you're going to get it to accomplish something, well, you can't fool the robot into functioning. Either you've put the parts together in a way that is logical, that is capable of lifting the loads that you're intending it to lift, or you've miscalculated and it won't lift those loads, or it won't behave in a coordinated fashion. And so the key is that any system in which you will know at the point that you have actually come to understand the system because the object itself will work, or in a different case, knowing a natural system well enough that you can predict things you don't know about where to find a creature or how that creature is likely to behave in response to some stimulus or something. Those systems are ones in which you are incapable of deluding yourself into believing attractive fictions, because if what you believe is false, it won't be effective. So I am a strong advocate for the idea of taking authority out of the role of training your mind to function well to the extent possible.
There is a relationship between authority and wisdom, like the wise man, or at least within the human cultural sphere. Those who are wise tend to be given a certain amount of authority, or they're speaking from a position of authority.
Absolutely.
But did they earn that authority, perhaps? Or
well, there's certainly false. There's false wisdom. There's self-help gurus that aren't, in fact, very insightful. On the other hand, what you will tend to discover if you look at what people who are actually understood to be wise tend to say is it often has a counterintuitive kind of ring to it, right? And so that counterintuitiveness is about, it's really a product of not leaping to conclusions. The intuitive conclusion seems right, and you can convince yourself that it's true. The wise conclusion requires you to step back and to think more carefully about in what way something might be incorrect. So let me give you a cool example. This is from the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He points out, and actually he takes the example from a stint that he did in the Israeli military, in which he was charged with trying to improve the training protocol for fighter pilots. And the trainers were under the impression that rewarding people didn't work and that punishing them did work. And the reason that they thought this was because it was more or less reflected in their experience, that when somebody did something really well and you congratulated them for it, the next time they went up and did something, they tended to do it less well. And when somebody did something really badly and you scolded them for it, they tended to improve, right? And that seems like a very straightforward pattern. Well, if that's true, if you scold people and they do better and you congratulate them and they do worse, then obviously what you should do is scold them, right? Well, no, it's actually not true. The pattern is the result of something called reversion to the mean. Reversion to the mean means that when you do something better than you usually do it, chances are the next time you try, you won't do as well, right? If you're throwing darts and you tend to throw them at some distance from the center and you happen to get one really close to the center, chances you're going to pull it off twice in a row are pretty low. So if you imagine a person throws a dart, it gets way closer to the center than they tend to get, and you say, that was great, and then they throw another dart and it's not near close to the center, you'll get the sense that they didn't react well to being congratulated, when in fact it was just a reversion to the mean. And that explains the other pattern too, which is somebody does something really crappy compared to their usual, and you say, how could you possibly have screwed that up? And then the next time they tend to do better. That's not an indication that your scolding them did them any good. So in any case, it takes wisdom to ignore the fact that the pattern seems to reflect this very obvious way of organizing rewards and penalties to get people to succeed, and notices that there's some entirely other reason for the pattern that you think you've observed. The cleverest scientists, in my field at least, and my guess is this would be true in every field, but in my field, the cleverest scientists are the ones that have really good intuition, right? We tend to think they're the ones with the fastest, highest horsepower brains, and I just don't think this is right. They're the ones that know how to allocate their attention in order to spot the things that others haven't seen, or the ones that know the sound of an appealing fiction. If you know what an appealing fiction sounds like, there's a pretty good chance that those appealing fictions may have become the assumptions that support some wrong model. And if you're trying to replace that model with one that works better, then just knowing that something doesn't quite ring true, that it's the kind of thing people will have embraced because they want it to be true rather than because they actually have that knowledge, that gives you a way into puzzles. Or another way of thinking about this, let's suppose that you're interested in solving big questions in a field where there still are lots of big questions, like my field, for example. Well, what are the chances that you are going to be smarter in the sense of having a higher horsepower brain than all of the other people who've looked at those same questions? Vanishingly low, right? There are a lot of smart people, and they pass through all of these fields. So what are the chances that you're going to be better read than all of the people who have looked at these questions? Again, vanishingly low. There will be people who've read everything. So you need to do something else that distinguishes you in some way. In fact, you have to overcome the advantage of the really well-read, extremely high horsepower brains that have tried to traverse that territory ahead of you. And it involves counterintuitive things like scrutinizing the observations that they all accepted without question, right? If you go back and look at the observation or the assumptions of the models that they're using, whereas everybody else's instinct is to go forward and just simply accept the observations and pursue, things at the remote edge. Well, should one of those assumptions be wrong, then that's where your advantage comes from. So this results in a kind of wisdom, and weirdly, wisdom has a kind of slow, almost childlike character to it.
Well, isn't that a contradiction?
Yeah, why is it a contradiction? It's a good question. I would say, Bob Trivers pointed out in this paper that I think I talked to you about once before, where he advised people not to take a job at any institution that didn't have undergraduates. And his point about undergraduates is they don't yet know what questions they're not supposed to ask, and so they keep you agile, because stuff that you've long ago given up on thinking about, they'll cause you to return to it, and if there's something wrong with it, you'll discover it that way. So I guess the point would be, if you took all of the questions that people don't ask once they've left the early stages of some field, some tiny fraction of those questions are still good, and in fact really good, right? They're really the thing you should be thinking about. But you've moved on from the whole category. Well, okay, now you're going to be stuck competing with everybody else using the same tools they are, and you're unlikely to succeed. So when I say that the wisdom seems childlike, wisdom is like the edit of all of the vast swath of undisciplined questions that children ask to that small number of undisciplined questions that are good enough to point the direction that everybody's been missing.
You were talking about that which is counterintuitive has a relationship with the wisdom, and you also said that good scientists need to have a certain sort of intuition, or to be intuitive. So it's almost like wisdom is a form of counterintuitive intuition, or an intuition for that which is counterintuitive.
I think because wisdom is often phrased counterintuitively, maybe more poetically than other kinds of truth, it liberates one to search in a way that is non-linear, which is oftentimes what you need to do. In order to find that thing that is missing, you need to search in some way that you may not be able to fully justify. And that it is liberty to search in a way that cannot be fully accounted for, but nonetheless often results in progress.
You still need to maintain your direction and your smarts and your intelligence once you veer out of the authority of that standard truth or the accepted narrative. You're letting go of something. You're entering into a danger zone. You're entering into the unknown, but you need to somehow keep your smarts about you. When you go there, you still need to have some sort of guiding principle or guiding feeling or guiding intuition so that it's not completely wasted, so that you don't become just as confused as that confusion that you're trying to confront.
Well, Luca Turin has a thing that he says in his book, The Emperor. It's actually not his book, The Emperor of Scent, but the book is about him. What he said is that great scientists have to be, I think he says bipolar, and I think I don't agree with him in the literal sense. I don't think bipolar is exactly what he means, but his argument is that in order to do something really new, you have to be able to be passionate about the search for some new answer enough that you can follow that passion. You can fall in love with the idea enough to pursue it and get it right. And then you have to turn around and attempt to tear it down in order to figure out if it's actually correct. And so there's something about the tendency to seek an answer with what might seem like unjustified levels of obsession, and then to take that same answer that you've worked so hard to try to find and to attempt to dismantle it so forcefully that if it resists, you know actually it's right.
There's almost, I feel like almost a loneliness inherent in that, like a restlessness, a never being able to just relax and say, this is the truth, Eureka, I found it.
Well, that is a funny aspect of the, boy, how do I say this? At some point, as I was going through training to be a scientist, like everybody else, I looked at what the future might hold. What does it take to get a job in which somebody actually pays you to pursue scientific truths? And what are those jobs? And what truth can you pursue? And whether it was completely conscious or not, it became pretty clear that A, the chances of getting such a job were pretty darn small, and if you did get such a job, the questions that you would end up pursuing would be generally pretty narrow. They'd be in some little field where you got to be the expert or one of a couple of experts, but it wasn't going to be the beautiful search for marvelous truths that make you smile day after day. And I think in light of that discovery, which happens in graduate school, I started doing something else, which was, maybe I didn't realize how dangerous it was to building a career, but I started pursuing answers to questions that it seemed like we should know, but that we didn't, right? So I didn't think of it immediately this way, but it sort of started to be like big game hunting. Like there were things in evolutionary biology which were big, they were unanswered, and nobody really knew which direction to go, and so it sort of seemed like they were intractable. And my feeling was, okay, why are they intractable, and what would it take to make them tractable? And I think I developed a toolkit for figuring out how to approach those puzzles with enough naivete that I didn't make the same mistakes as the people for whom they were intractable. And that became a tremendous amount of fun. But in answer to your question, you get to what you accept yourself is the right answer to some very big puzzle. And there is that, the famous Eureka moment. There is, I mean, and it's almost it's a giddy, childish feeling, but it's marvelous. But it does make you hungry for the next one, right? And so there's a way in which it's not like, I think I found the answer to this great puzzle and now I can take it easy. It's like, no, where do I get more of that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.